Mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. If anyone in the chat can hear me, just push one. Make sure. All right, got a confirmation. Thank you for the confirmation. Welcome back to the Black Brain Trust. This is Geopolitics 413. Please hit the like button as you come in, share the video if possible, hit that notification bell so you get all the updates from the Black Brain Trust, including those posted on the community tab. There's a document description beneath the video for you to follow along with. Link will be in the chat if you want to engage in the discussion. A happy New Year to everyone. Happy New Year to everyone in the chat as well. Give a shout out to everybody in the chat. Dre Raphael, salute. Sherrod Martin, peace. Marvin Evans, what's going on? Luis Cabrera, what's up? Tony Smith, peace. Motor City Red, what's going on? Happy New Year to you. Or Owens, peace. Marvin Evans, what's going on? Yeah, so let me get started with the first item on the docket because we're already late. So I want to make sure that I'm not keeping you guys. All right, first item on the docket is from theguardian.com. Native American land taxes, a step on the roadmap for reparations. Let me expand this out. In the San Francisco Bay Area, local residents and businesses can pay to help restore indigenous land to indigenous stewardship. The 2-acre plot deep within East Oakland is a bright green oasis surrounded by urban sprawl. The creek that runs through it has been sealed with cement, and an interstate highway has been built overhead. But for Karina Gold, this piece of land represents justice for Native Californians. It is the first parcel promised to the Socorrera Tilan Trust, an intertribal women-led organization that Gold co-founded in order to restore indigenous land in the Bay Area to indigenous stewardship. This is where my people, the Lejan people, come from, said Gold, a spokeswoman for the Confederate villages of Lejan and a community organizer. She often imagines her grandparents sitting by the creek back when salmon still swam through it. To help the Socorrera Tilan Trust rework the land, populate it with native fruits and herbs, transform it into a community, and to restore even more land to Californians' indigenous community, local residents and businesses can pay the organization a Shumi land tax. Interesting. Shumi in our language means gift. Gould explained, non-native residents can choose to pay the tax as a way to show support and gratitude for the native people hosting them on their ancestral lands. Over the past year, politicians and presidential candidates have expressed an increasing desire to right historical wrongs against indigenous people and Black Americans. Interesting. Scholars of indigenous law and policy say the issue of how best to deliver justice to Native Americans is exceedingly complex. And the use of the word reparations in this context is often fraught. But grassroots programs in the Bay Area and around the country can provide insight into what form these types of social justice efforts could take. For Gold, the Shumi land tax is a way to begin undoing centuries of erasure. When she first began her work, when she first began her work as an activist for indigenous sovereignty 2 decades ago, she said most people thought that we were dead, that we no longer existed. In fact, indigenous Californians were literally written out of the books. Spanish settlers and missionaries called the native people who lived long ago in the Northern Californian coast Costaneos. And later, anthropologists plucked the term Olón from historical records to use as a catch-all. In 1925, Al Corbett, excuse me, a local anthropologist declared that the Olón people were extinct so far as all practical purposes are concerned. The government further drove this erasure by refusing to uphold the original treaties negotiated between the U.S. and Californian tribes, leaving dozens of tribes without federal recognition or land rights. The Shumi tax, Gould said, is in one sense very practical. It's a monetary donation that can help Native people in California regain access to stolen land, but the tax is also symbolic. It's a way for Bay Area residents to show respect for the original stewards of the land. A similar program in Northern California allows residents of the Humboldt Bay region to pay a voluntary tax to the Wyandotte people. And in Seattle, nearly 4,300 residents have signed up to pay the Duwamish tribe symbolic rent. Real Rent Seattle was started by the Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites, a group made up of white people in the Seattle area working to undo institutional racism. Interesting. Whereas the Shumi land tax program allows people to calculate their tax based on the size of their home and whether they rent or own property. Real Rent recommends amounts based on annual income. In both cases, people are free to donate more or less than what's suggested, or people can contribute a symbolic figure like $18.55 to reference to the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, in which the Duwamish signed 54,000 acres of land over to the colonial settlers in exchange for a reservation and hunting and fishing rights that were never granted. Paying rent is just a straightforward way that people feel that they can take action to do something to try and right the wrongs of our government, said Patrick Teff, who helped organize the Real Rent program, because we're all tired of sitting and waiting for the federal government to address the injustice. The idea of a broader federal program to deliver justice to Native Americans does appear to be gaining political traction. Several 2020 Democratic presidential candidates have released plans to address issues affecting Native Americans. In July, Julian Castro released a policy plan to better support tribal sovereignty by establishing tribal advisory committees in every cabinet level agency and supporting legislation to protect tribal cultural heritage, among other things. We deserve a president who will strengthen tribal sovereignty, honor treaty commitments, ensure justice for indigenous women, and advance tribal federal partnerships for progress, Castro said in a statement introducing his plan. Several other candidates, including Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders, have released their own plans and proposals, along with Deb Haaland, one of the first two Native American women to be elected to Congress. Elizabeth Warren proposed a wide-ranging honoring Promises to Native Nations Act, which aims to hold the federal government accountable for honoring legal promises made to Native Americans and upholding sovereignty in Indian country. Prior to releasing the plan, Warren had also indicated that Native Americans should be part of the conversation or on reparations for Black Americans, though Warren has yet to expand on that notion or include it in any of her official policies. Her mention of reparations for Indigenous people sparked a debate about what that would mean and whether it's an idea worth pursuing at all. I was really pleased to see Elizabeth Warren putting on the table a proposal for fully funding the United States obligation to Indian country, said Matthew Fletcher, a law professor and director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center at the Michigan State University College of Law. That would be absolutely huge. But the word reparations in this context is politically fraught, and it's kind of a misnomer, he said, because the U.S. signed treaties with tribes promising certain services and rights in exchange for land. It's not reparations if we're talking about something the U.S. already owes.
That's called making good on an obligation.
I don't really think.
Contract dispute.
Yep. I don't really think anybody's taken a serious theoretical consideration on what reparations are in the context of Indian people would look like. The United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights Indigenous People uses the term restitution through Dina Gilio Whitaker, the policy director and senior research associate at the Center for World Indigenous Studies, prefers to frame discussions around the idea of decolonization. I would say restoring justice, but there's never really been justice in the first place, she said. Justice for Native people is about confronting the privilege of settler colonialism. We mentioned the United Nations on that other panel last night, and yeah, that's how it goes. To that end, Gilio Whitaker is broadly an advocate for policies that reinforce the sovereignty of tribal governments and consult indigenous people on policies that affect indigenous people and their land. Programs in California and Washington are just one of the numerous kinds of strategies for decolonizing, she said. This spring, for the first time in maybe a century, wild strawberries grew by what Gold refers to as Lejeune Creek, which runs along the Sogorea T Land Trust's parcel in East Oakland. There are these little tiny things, Gold said, about half the size of most supermarket varieties, and sweet, very sweet, very, very sweet. The strawberries were just one of the native plants that workers and volunteers have planted on Sogorea land across the Bay Area, which now includes a garden in West Oakland and a portion of a community farm to the north. Tobacco, sage, and mugwort have flourished on these patches, which Gold likes to say have been rematriated under indigenous stewardship. The Shawumi tax helps pay for the staff and supplies to transfer these tracts. The land trust doesn't necessarily hold the deeds to all the properties yet. The 2 acres in East Oakland are technically owned by a not-for-profit called Planting Justice, which maintains a nursery on more than half the plot and is working to pay off its mortgage before transferring property rights to Sogorea T. At that point, Sogorea T will lease some of the land back to Planting Justice. Interesting. For now, the technicalities matter less to Gold, who is most concerned with ensuring that indigenous leaders are able to govern how the land is maintained on the East Oakland plot, in addition to cultivating culturally significant plants. Gold has overseen the construction of a ceremonial arbor, a rainwater harvesting facility, and an emergency shelter built from an old shipping container. The latter is a resiliency hub for the whole community, Gold said, because part of Lejeune philosophy is to take care of everybody living on their land. We see ourselves as the host of this land, Gold said, and we want to be able to take care of all of our guests. So reparations, have to be careful with these terms because in context they mean something. Restitution in this context would be restitution. So yeah, that's how that goes. What's going on, Complex?
I'm chilling, bro. Had a pretty interesting opening to the new year. And so for those who may not have caught our earlier stream or what have you, Happy New Year. Nothing changes for 2020. We're gonna get at these topics and these subjects in depth as we always do. Nothing changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think studying other people's attempts to get reparations is actually reparation, restitution, and equity are terms that we have to really sit down and study. We have to really do a live stream a live stream on these terms and where they apply modern day Black community, modern day Black America.
I agree 100%, bro. I really do. Because I would say, was it during like late spring, summer, we focused a lot on social equity, right? As a reparative measure, right? So it kind of speaks to what equity is versus what reparation is versus what restitution is,
Mm-hmm.
right? You see, so one other thing that may be happening here is that when we look at what collectively we think we ought to receive in terms of reparations, sometimes we may have to actually break up the claim. Some of it may actually be restitution because some of the stuff may be contractual, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is equity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? See, so kind of following with New Year's Eve, the discussion earlier today, New Year's Day, and even on into this, we need to get into the mode of now really digging into the nuts and bolts of things. So I think, this article that you highlighted here is a very good case study, for, let's just say, 40 acres and a mule.
Mm-hmm.
Obligation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to make something that applies to us applicable to this article here, we could start there. But all I'm saying here is that we have to really start to pay attention to what other groups are doing to either receive restitution, reparation, or equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's interesting about the article is actually women leading the brigade. I don't know if you'll find the same sort of commitment from those in the manager. But
That's been go ahead, Mike. Go
yeah,
ahead.
but they were able to do this without firing a shot. That's what I find interesting. That is because they're talking about land. I mean, we're just talking about HR 40, right? I mean, people are just talking about HR 40. It doesn't apply to me, but the bill is on the table. I think the wrong people are at the table having these conversations, and that's what's really dragging, dragging the case here, so to speak. So when it comes to social equity, that took what? I mean, I think California did legal. I don't know what 1996 California did.
96 is when it went legal.
Yeah, right. So there's time in place here, in terms of the legalization aspect.
Mm-hmm.
When we start talking about fourth industrialized emerging tech and upskilling and things of that nature, there has to be a case put on the table, not for reparations or restitution, but for equity, social equity in fourth industrialization in urban environments. How do you get Black people to be Black communities to be a part of that industrialization?
Mm-hmm.
That's the key, right? So we have to draft proposals for that, for such an idea and how not to get left behind.
I mean, and look, we kind of we sort of put I would say some framework together, right? Because look,
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, there's many ways to skin a cat. So this is not to say that anything that's coming out of the brain trust is the way. It's whatever way is applicable that you can implement. That is the way. If you can implement it, that was the way, right? One way that we discussed was using pre-existing infrastructure to create things like Maker Labs, for example.
Yeah.
That was one angle that you know that we proposed that you take on that, because from that standpoint, what you could then do is, if you have pre-existing infrastructure, that means you already have an enclosure or a place to house things like technological assets, 3D printers, computers, things like that. And if you have a pre-existing infrastructure and a model that says, well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to take children in the community, bring them into this program, and then have them start to create things and training them in. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just saying a tech incubator. Is
exactly. Then what happens? Yeah. Then what ends up happening is that you start to get corporate interest in that, and you know, in the realm of what we're talking about, that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a form of investment. So some company says, hey, look, we'd like to donate five 3D printers, right? And let's just say a kid goes through the program, goes to junior high, high school, gets into college, and then he ends up applying for a job at the company that donated the 3D printers, say like 7-8 years prior to him graduating. And in the interview, the kid says, yeah, you know, actually, you know, I was in this tech incubator program for you know, for kids, and you know, I learned on your printers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not even just that, you know, certifications that are college accredited, you know, by the state itself.
You know what I mean? It's
not
like
only increase your college enrollment without actually breaking the bank, because it's already baked into the incubator itself.
Right. This is an equity model.
Yes.
That's an equity model, right? Something that could net you similar, same or similar benefits as a reparative measure or restitution measure. But in this case, an equity model is more applicable. So we really have to start to look at what our needs are and what's applicable to obtain them.
Yeah. Yeah, let me get to this next.
Yeah.
All right, this one is from intercept.com. Glenn Greenwald's exclusive interview with Bolivia's Evo Morales, who was deposed in a coup. Let me spin it. So, all right. Evo Morales, who served as the president of Bolivia for 13 years and presided over extraordinary economic growth and a reduction of inequality, praised even by his critics, announced that he was resigning the presidency under duress, with implicit threats from the Bolivian military. Morales later made clear that he viewed these events as a classic right-wing military coup of the kind that has plagued the continent for decades, explaining that he was removed from his position by force and then ultimately pressured by a police mutiny and military threats to flee his own country. Morales went to Mexico, where he was granted political asylum and has lived under heavy security in Mexico City ever since. Earlier this week, he was granted refugee status in Argentina. On December 3rd, I sat with Morales in Mexico City for an hour-long interview that was wide-ranging in scope, not only about the events that led to his removal and exile from Bolivia, but also a broader trend in regional and global politics, as well as the role played by the U.S. in Latin America. We discussed who was behind this coup, what its motives are, the role played by both the U.S. and Brazil, the use of violence by the right-wing interior government against indigenous protesters, the criticisms voiced against him for seeking a fourth term despite constitutional term limits, and how his removal by military force in favor of an unelected right-wing coup regime led by the country's white Christian minority reflects broader trends in Latin American politics and global political trends generally. And so the same sort of forces that exist in the United States and in the Bible Belt actually exist right down there on the ground. For those who don't know, former President Evo Morales actually brought wealth to the country by removing the privatization and restoring the rights back to the indigenous population, which he is the first indigenous president of the country in its modern day.
Yeah,
And
he nationalized the nation's natural resources.
right. And what a lot of people don't realize that the resources that are under the ground, Bolivia has the largest lithium deposits in the world sitting under the feet of the indigenous people. And the amount of wealth that would have been brought to these people would have been immense. And these are the sort of objectives of being a Pan-Africanist or a pro indigenous person. That's what happens when you get that sort of leadership in power and you get that sort of consolidation of thoughts and ideas. And so because of that, all automakers like Tesla would have had to come to Bolivia to get those deposits for their battery, their battery packs on their vehicles, which would have brought trillions of dollars to the continent. But it didn't just stop there. He actually came up with a gold-backed currency, a dinar for the indigenous people, which would have gave immense wealth. It would have turned Bolivia into, let's say, the Dubai. Or
yeah, I was just about to go there. I was about to say the Qatar or the Dubai of the South American nations.
Yeah, and so that's the sort of movements that are going on outside the United States, while people in this country hide behind a hashtag. This is what's really going on the ground. He was the Gaddafi of Latin America, if that makes any sense.
Makes a whole lot of sense. Hence his removal.
All right. If you want to watch the video, you all can check it out in the chat after the live stream is over. I think it's actually a pretty good thing. All right, we get on to the next one. If he had still been in power, he would have opened up the floodgates, for more African Americans who had the skill set to go mine these deposits down there. Could have had a stake, could have put it on a blockchain, could have had ownership.
Let's not go down that slippery slope.
Could have been involved in that.
I'm telling you, man. Let's not. Yeah.
Could have had 1% of $1 trillion. What the hell is this?
Let's just put it like this, folks. He would have been more apt to do business with you.
Yeah, I'm curious though, why he didn't go to Brazil. I mean, not Brazil. Venezuela. Why didn't he go to Venezuela if the heat was on his back like that? It would have been a short trip across the border.
Because Venezuela got its own heat. I think there's just heat across the board, and given that you already have your destabilization elements in Venezuela, right? We saw what was going on there. Same shit going on in Bolivia. Who the fuck do you trust? Like just internally, you don't know who to trust internally, because Bolivia was destabilized internally. Let's not get it twisted, folks. The military coup. That's how this happened. Okay? What happened over in Venezuela? They tried the same shit on Maduro. So not only is it that you can't trust internally in your own government, in your own nation, how the fuck do you trust who do you trust over in the country that you on paper have an alliance with, and through accords you have an alliance with, but if both of y'all are being destabilized from inside, I mean, shit, man.
Yeah, so let me get to the next item on the docket from Telesur. 61 years strong, Cuba's revolution lives on despite blockade. Oh man, this is gonna be really tight. A day that will forever live in the hearts and minds of free men. and women around the world, January 1st, 1959 marked the triumph of the Cuban Revolution as the military dictatorship of Fulgencio, I can't even pronounce his name, Batista, ended under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Ernesto Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and Raul Castro, among others. And on its 61st anniversary, the ideals of socialist society and state live on despite an illegal and brutal blockade installed by the United States in 1962 to undermine the project in the Cuban island, a policy which has been bolstered by the current US President Donald Trump. Cuba has demonstrated time and time again that despite the asymmetric power, they are well versed in strategies to delegitimize the US position. US professor of international relations Arturo Lopez Levy argues. These counter strategies are cemented in the resilient spirit of the Cuban people in their commitment to the revolution, which began in 1956 as a group of 81 revolutionaries set sail to Cuba from Mexico in the famed Grama. After the vessel crashed near Los Coelhos, Batista's men ambushed them, and the revolutionaries were left with 19 men. The Castro brothers, Cienfuegos and Che, who fled deep into Sierra Mastra mountains to a remote hideout that became the base from where the revolutionaries started guerrilla warfare leading to Batista's overthrow. 19 men. 3 years later, as the new year gave way, a rebel force led by revolutionary leader Fidel Castro seized the capital Havana, forcing Batista to flee. From then on, revolutionary Cuba saw a series of reforms aimed at improving society. The healthcare and education sector was developed immensely, with Cuban doctors traveling the world, working with marginalized sections, providing free healthcare for all. The country also became illiteracy free in 1961, within a year of starting a literacy mission, dropping from 23.6% to a mere 3.6%. Presently, the rate of illiteracy is 0.2%, one of the highest in the world. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Yet all of these efforts to better the lives of this population have been met with resistance and violence from its neighbors in the North. In February 1962, President John F. Kennedy proclaimed a trade embargo between the U.S. and Cuba and directed the Departments of Commerce and the Treasury to implement it, which remains in place today. Since then, Cuba-U.S. relations have had their ups and downs correlated to the intensity or ease of sanctions aimed at isolating the government. In 2014, President Barack Obama administration initiated a major policy shift, moving away from the sanctions towards engagement and dialogue. Certain travel and business restrictions were loosened in a bid for the normalization of relations. The policy changes included the recession of Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of international terrorism in May 2015, the restoration of diplomatic relations in July 2015, and efforts to increase travel, commerce, and the flow of information to Cuba by easing restrictions on travel, remittances, trade, telecommunications, and banking and financial services. The restoration of relations led to increased government-to-government engagement, with over 20 bilateral agreements negotiated and bilateral dialogues conducted in numerous areas of cooperation, which correlated with a major shift in Cuba's economic policies as well. However, on June 16, 2017, the newly elected President Trump issued a national security presidential memorandum on strengthening the policy of the United States towards Cuba. By November 8, 2017, the Departments of State, Commerce, and the Treasury reimposed the business and travel restrictions. Through 2017, Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act, Cuba was placed once again as a priority enemy. Rehashing of Cold War era discourse and propaganda was laid out by Trump's administration to appease the Cuban U.S. Electorate in Florida and to undermine the government in Havana. Cuba seems to have the same effect on American administrations that the full moon once had on werewolves. Wayne Smith, the U.S. diplomat who closed the country's embassy in Havana in 1961 and later returned to Cuba as chief of the Special Interest Selection, once said, "The vicious wolves from Trump's administration, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton and current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, set their eyes on its prey, Cuba. Trump trotted along to impose even harsher sanctions and direct attacks on the island's economy. The most infamous was the activation of the Helms-Burton Act, Title 3 and 4, suspended since 1996, starting May 2nd. The Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, commonly known as Helms-Burton, was signed on March 12, 1996, during former President Bill Clinton's administration to disrupt foreign investment to the island and accentuate the economic efforts of the economic blockade. Ruthless, man. Ruthless people. Through the application of Title III, U.S. citizens could sue in their country's courts those persons and entities that conduct business with about 200 state-owned institutions in Cuba that were nationalized after January 1st, 1959. However, since the Clinton administration, the U.S. had avoided the implementation of this measure by issuing temporary 6-month suspensions. So what they're talking about is no different than reparations for the slave masters who lost their agriculture or their goods on their land
Right.
when the Civil War was over.
Right.
All right. Yeah, this is very interesting. It's a shame too because they have a lower literacy rate than the United States, but yet no one will talk about that. Better healthcare, but no one will talk about that. No one will talk about that. Oh, it's socialism bad and capitalism good. Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. It's gonna have to change at some point, man.
Yeah. All right. Get to the next item on the docket.
All right. And Mike, if I'm muted for a second, bro, I got some black eyed peas on the stove, man.
All right.
Shout out to those who fucks with black eyed peas as a New Year's tradition.
Yeah, they were a great group too.
Mm-hmm.
No, they were a great hip hop group. Yeah.
Yeah, shout out to Will, App, Taboo.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me get to the next item on the docket. All right. Next item on docket is from BBC.com. U.S. atomic waste dump in Marshall Islands to be investigated. This is interesting. So I'll kind of reference some of the stuff that we've covered before. Dubbed the Tomb, it holds tons of radioactive debris from dozens of U.S. atomic bomb tests carried out during the Cold War. Congress wants the Department of Energy to report back on the state of the aging Runit Dome within 6 months. The demand is part of a huge defense bill approved by President Trump. More than 40 nuclear weapons tests took place on the island, took place on or near Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific between 1946 and 1958, including a bomb test on Runit Island. The crater from the blast was used from the 1970s by the Defense Nuclear Agency to store nuclear waste. It was later covered in thick concrete slabs to form the 377-foot protective dome. There are concerns that the structure is deteriorating and could be vulnerable to sea level rise caused by climate change. Energy Secretary Dan Borlett is required to report back to the White House or to the House and Senate Armed Services committees with a detailed plan to repair the dome to ensure that it does not have any harmful effects on to the local population, environment, or wildlife. The report must also assess the condition of the outside of the structure and what effect the environment and rising sea levels might have. The condition of the dome was highlighted in a Los Angeles Times investigation, which also unearthed evidence of biological weapons tests and the shipping of 130 tons of soil from nuclear testing grounds to Nevada to the Marshall Islands. Interesting, didn't know that. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed concern about the risk of leaking of radioactive materials from the dome after meeting Marshall Islands President Hilda Heim in May. The amendment to the defense bill was brought forward by Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who is in the race to become the Democrats' nominee in next year's presidential election and represents Hawaii's 2nd district. The U.S. government is responsible for the shortage or the storage site and must ensure the protection of the people and our environment from the toxic waste stored there, she said in June. At the time of nuclear test, the Marshall Island was a territory created by the United Nations, but administered by the U.S. It has been independent since 1979. Yeah, after nobody could live there. So we referenced a documentary by John Pilger called The Coming War in China. And if you have an opportunity to watch that documentary, he talks about the Marshall Islands as a test site for nuclear weapons that the United States government was using.
Back was that during the 50s?
Yeah, the 50s and the 60s.
Right. And didn't we actually do it like an actual hangout on that documentary? I think it was primarily like you and Nagon, right?
Yeah, I think we're like the only 2 or 3 that watched it. It's a great documentary. I've watched it twice. I can't stress enough. You're going to learn a lot about it, about global politics in all one setting. And this island, man, they bombed this island with nuclear weapons, but they told the people it was safe to go back to it.
Right.
And they went back there and had all types of issues, man, biological issues, man. To this very day.
We're talking about these are melanated people too, by the way.
Yeah, people dying in their 30s and 40s, man, from the fallout.
Mike, what's the name? If you can just, because if you search the name in the video listing on the Black Brain Trust channel, that hangout should come up.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find that real quick.
All right.
Actually, Oh, okay, yeah,
Got it?
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so great documentary. I can't stress enough, man. That's good learning material. All right, let me get to the next item on the docket. All right, speaking of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this one is on the national interest. Make no mistake, China would destroy U.S. cities in a nuclear war.
Well, okay.
Mhm.
God.
No one wins in a nuclear war. Let me expand this out. I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's pretty long. When one reads enough Chinese naval literature, diagrams of multi-axial cruise missile saturation attacks against aircraft carrier groups may begin to seem normal. However, one particular graphic from the October 2015 issue of the Naval Journal, Naval and Merchant Ships, stands out as both unusual and singularly disturbing. It purports to map the impact of a Chinese intercontinental ballistic missile ICBM strike by 20 nuclear armed rockets against the United States. Targets include the biggest cities on the east and west coast, as well as in the Midwest, as one would expect. Giant radiation plumes would cover much of the country, and the estimate in the caption holds that the strike would yield perhaps 50 million people killed. The map would the map below that graphic on the same page illustrates the optimal aim point for a hit on New York City within a blast wave that vaporizes all Manhattan and well beyond. That makes the North Korean threat look fairly insignificant by comparison, doesn't it? But what's really disturbing is that the scenario described above envisions a strike by China's largely antiquated DF-5. Dongfeng is the actual term. Dongfeng 5. First generation ICBM. In other words, the illustration is perhaps a decade or more out of date. As China has deployed first the road mobile DF-31, then DF-31A, and now JL-2, a submarine launched nuclear weapon. China nuclear strategy has moved from assured retaliation to what one may term complete assured retaliation. Indeed, the actual theme of the article featuring those graphics concerns recent reports regarding testing of the DF-41 mobile ICBM. The author of that article, who is careful to note that his views do not represent those of the publication, observes that when a Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson was queried about the test on August 6, 2015, the spokesperson did not deny that DF-41 exists. The author also cites U.S. intelligence reports, concluding that 4 tests have now been conducted, including one that demonstrates multiple re-entry vehicle (MIRV) technology. The author estimates that the DF-41 will finally provide China with the capability to launch missiles from north-central China and hit all targets in the U.S. except Florida. I don't know why Florida is like excluded. With the goal of better understanding the rapidly evolving strategic nuclear balance between China and the US and its significance. This Dragon Eye surveys some recent Mandarin language writings on the subject of Chinese nuclear forces. To be sure, a flurry of Chinese writings on the nuclear balance did follow after the September parade in Beijing that highlighted Chinese missile forces. Perhaps the most remarkable revelation from the parade was the unveiling of the DF-26, a new longer-range anti-ship ballistic missile based on the revolutionary shorter-range cousin, the DF-21D ASBM. In fact, the November 2015 issue of the aforementioned journal ran a series of articles on the DF-26. In those articles, the weapons is described multiple times as a nuclear conventional dual purpose weapon. The major thrust on the article in that issue on the impact of the DF-26 on nuclear strategy seems to be to try to debug the argument that China's deployment of this new type of missile is destabilizing. Like their American counterparts, Chinese strategists seem to be increasingly practiced at selling the argument that more and new types of weapons enhance deterrence and thus strategic stability. Despite the developments related above, the balance of opinion in Beijing seems impressively moderate on the prospects for a major nuclear buildup by China. In the allegedly nationalist forum of Global Times, one commentator from the China Institute for International Studies, for example, offered a few illuminating comments about a year ago in an expert forum entitled, "How Many Nuclear Warheads Are Enough for China?" He is evidently concerned that we have heard some new voices calling to build a nuclear force appropriate for a great power. Instead, he argues that China must continue to focus on building a small, elite, and effective nuclear forces. Likewise, a former vice director of the Chinese Navy Nuclear Security Bureau offers that China is a medium-sized nuclear power, which should learn from the experience of the Britain and France and deploy no fewer than 4 submarines carrying nuclear weapons, far fewer than operated by either Russia or the United States. I'm not sure why anybody would have these advertisements up like this. Who pours this type of stuff on their feet?
What is that, like apple cider or some shit?
I think so. I'm hoping it's not like Pine Sol or something.
Right. Yeah, that's a strange ad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought it was nuclear. Yeah. One can still find that same analysis ample concern among Chinese specialists regarding new directions in U.S. military capabilities that could threaten China's deterrent. Another concern amply evident in Chinese writings concerns tactical nuclear weaponry. Most of this reporting of late concerns a recent upgrade to the American B-61 nuclear bomb, sorry. A full-page graphic in the same issue that discusses the DF-41 issues, the DF-41 missile test offer many specifics on the B-61, including its dial-a-yield feature that enables the operator to choose the instruction on a scale ranging from 50 to 0.3 kilotons. That same month in the magazine Aerospace Knowledge, a centerfold featured the SS-26 Iskander, a Russian short-range tactical nuclear weapon. Elsewhere, I have moreover documented Chinese discussions of tactical nuclear weapons for the anti-submarine warfare, as well as the importance of nuclear-tipped submarine launch cruise missiles for strategy in the late Cold War. Let's hope that these are just academic discussions in the Chinese context and do not reflect actual weapons under development. This is really serious business because China is not a signature to the INF, which is the intermediary nuclear armed forces treaty, which means that you can't have these sort of nuclear weapons that can be fired across land in the heat of a battle. The Russians and not the Russians, but the Americans and the Soviet Union had this in the 80s. And what happened was the Soviet Union collapsed, and therefore it's null and void. You know, Bush told what's this guy with the birthmark on his head?
Gorbachev.
Prof, that you know, NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, and next thing you know, they're right on their doorstep, you know, having coffee and stuff. So,
and basically haven't moved since.
Yeah, and so Russia felt it, you know, its back is against the wall when you have a third military on its doorstep in the last 150 years. The first time was Napoleon, and then Germany under Hitler, and now you have NATO basically sitting at their doorstep. That's a very scary experience if you're a Russian. And if you're China too, you're worried too that you have these yo-yos in South Korea that can make it across the border if they make it past the DMZ, which I doubt they would. But still, the point of the matter is they do have weapons that can penetrate right into China. I would be concerned as well.
Hey, Mike, do we have anybody in the back chat or anything?
I don't think anybody's there. Yeah, nobody's there.
Okay, I was just wondering.
All right, let me get to this next article. All right, this one is from Stratfor. The Iranian-U.S. confrontation in Iraq grows hotter. Oh, man. Iraqi militias backed by Tehran have threatened retaliation after U.S. airstrikes killed dozens of fighters, elevating the risk that a pattern of strike and counterstrike will take root. So, for those who don't know, there's something called a PMU, Popular Mobilization Units. So these are the militias on the ground who put up a fight, who took up arms against ISIS back in 2015, coming out of Mosul in Iraq. And they were able to push back against these ISIS fighters back to the Syrian border. And I think most of them actually crossed the Syrian border back into Syria. And because of that, the United States government actually did not interfere in the liberation of Iraq by the PMU. And so now that it is just about peacetime, and you have all of these militias with all these guns, this is the equivalent of whites in the South, white men in the South, after they drove out the British back in 1776. And so you have these militias with these weapons, these military grade weapons and vehicles, that is actually a formidable force. It's actually 100,000 of them, which is a formidable force for a military. And you have the United States sitting right there in that country, and they actually are not too kind with having an Iranian-backed militia sitting at its doorstep, or at least at its embassy. And so they surrounded the embassy and wanted to oust the U.S. government out of its embassy and out of the country itself. And so the U.S. military bombed them. That's the extent of the information for right now. We'll get to the next article. Some more should probably come up. Let me drop the link in the chat in case anybody's trying to get on. Matt Blaylock says, do you guys think we should be more concerned with nuclear warfare or cyber warfare? We're already in a cyber war. We're already in a cyber war. We've been in cyber war for over 10 years now. There's been hit and run tactics every single day. Nuclear war is the next step, but cyber warfare, that's an ongoing fight. That's been going on for years. You're never gonna stop that. All right. All right. Next item on the docket is from The Guardian. U.S. troops deployed to Middle East after Baghdad embassy siege. I can't explain this out. Iranian-backed militants have ended a day-long siege on the American embassy in Baghdad following an order from the militia organization, but the struggle between the U.S. and Iran for influence in Iraq looks set to intensify further in 2020. The U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced that 750 airborne troops would be deployed to the region immediately, with more to follow in the next few days. Up to 3,000 soldiers are reportedly being prepared to move out to the Middle East, adding to the 14,000 sent there since May in an effort to counter Iran. This deployment is an appropriate and precautionary action taken in response to increased threat levels against U.S. personnel and facilities, such as we witnessed in Baghdad today. Esper said in a written statement, the United States will protect our people and interests anywhere they are found around the world. The troops being deployed are drawn from a rapid reaction unit in the Army's 82nd Born Division based at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Esper was vague on where they would be going, but a U.S. official familiar with the decision said their initial destination was Kuwait. The Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, an umbrella group for the desperate Shia militias operating in Iraq, issued a statement on Wednesday calling for the withdrawal of the several hundred militiamen and supporters who had mobbed the embassy on Tuesday. Many of them camped around the heavily fortified building overnight. They took over a reception area of the embassy compound, smashed windows, lit fires on the roof, and raised militia flags. They firebombed a second gate to the compound, but did not breach the main building. U.S. soldiers took up positions on the embassy roof and from there fired tear gas rounds into the crowd on Wednesday. After the PMF statement, the crowds began to disperse through members of Kachib Hezbollah, a Shia militia considered the most closely tied to Iran, initially refused to obey the instruction, waiting for an order from their own commanders, a reminder of the complex web of loyalties of the different groups involved in the embassy assault. The militants left Baghdad's diplomatic enclave waving militia banners and shouting victory slogans. Some vowed to return with weapons to remove the U.S. presence from Iraq entirely. The U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, put off a planned visit to Ukraine this week to monitor the situation in Iraq and ensure the safety and security of Americans in the Middle East, his spokeswoman said. The breach of the embassy compound came in response to the U.S. strikes on Sunday that killed 25 Hezbollah fighters. The U.S. said the strikes were in retaliation for last week's killing of an American contractor and the wounding of several U.S. soldiers in a rocket attack on an Iraqi military base. The latest of a string of attacks, which the U.S. blamed on the militia. The U.S. officials expressed dismay that Iraqi security forces had made no effort to stop the militiamen and their supporters from entering Baghdad's green zone and approaching the U.S. embassy. The inaction was in marked contrast to their brutal treatment of the anti-government and anti-Iranian protests in Baghdad and across the country, which broke out in October. The embassy siege marked a low point for relations between Iraq and the U.S. and were a show of strength by Iranian-controlled forces. Donald Trump blamed Iran for the attack and said Tehran would pay a big price for any U.S. lives lost or damage to the U.S. property. The deployment of thousands of reinforcements in the region in response to Iranian proxy attacks marks a sharp setback for his aspirations to extricate the U.S. from the region in the coming election year. So this is similar to what happened in Libya in 2011 with Hillary Clinton's buddy, the U.S. ambassador Stevens. And what happened in Libya was these guys were in Libya at a secret CIA location base, which was posed as an embassy, and a U.S. consulate. Sorry, a U.S. consulate, and they were there and left alone. They were trafficking weapons, to my knowledge, from Libya to Syria, and Ambassador Stevens was left unattended. The militias there, or was considered to be a militia there, they should be actually considered terrorists, bombed the consulate and it took them out. It took out the ambassador. A U.S. ambassador was killed.
Right.
Under the watch of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who was
Hillary Clinton. Right. Yep.
What's happening again is a repeat of the same actions in Baghdad. Now you have all these militias surrounding a U.S. embassy, threatening to bomb it, and the United States government is talking about sending in 750 troops. I'm sorry, you got about 10,000 guys with AK-47s sitting outside your embassy. I don't think 750 guys is going to be a worthy fight.
I'm not. I'll reserve an opinion on that one because, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot.
Just pretty much, yeah. It was like I really don't have much to kind of add on to that. Just look at the numbers. You tell me what makes sense.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me get to the next item on the docket. That is in relation to the last article. This one is from DW.com. The U.S. hits back at Iran-linked militia in Iraq after rocket attack. The U.S. this is really small. The U.S. carried out airstrikes in Iraq and Syria targeting an Iran-backed Iraqi militia blamed for a rocket attack that killed an American defense contractor and wounded 4 U.S. service members, the Pentagon said Sunday. The U.S. retaliation threatens to unleash a dangerous spiral of escalation and backlash against the U.S. military presence in Iraq at a time the country is politically unstable following nearly 3 months of deadly anti-government protests. U.S. forces conducted precision defense strikes against the 3 Hezbollah bases in Iraq and 2 others in Syria. Defense Department spokesman Jonathan Hoffman said in a statement, "The strikes will degrade Hezbollah's ability to conduct future attacks." He said, using an acronym for the group, adding that weapons facilities and command and control centers used to plan attacks against U.S. forces were hit. So we don't even know, or they don't even know, if it was actually these guys. They just bombed it anyways. And what I find interesting is that okay, you bombed these people, but that's not 100% accurate if it was them or not. It could have been quite a few groups that are there. The militia groups comprised of like 100 different groups. That makes up 100,000. There are about 10,000 per group.
Right.
So we don't even know who actually did it. We just know that somebody got bombed for it. Some guys could have been probably playing dominoes or something, around a campfire, and hellfire missile dropped on their head. They don't even know what happened.
Or a wedding, for example. Because
Yeah.
we know that one's happened for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me get to the next item on the docket real quick. This one's from Press TV. U.S. taking revenge on Iraqi popular forces for defeating Daesh, leader says. You are witnessing what the Americans, are doing in Iraq and Syria. They are taking revenge on al-Shabaab, al-Shahabi, because it paralyzed and eventually eliminated Daesh, which the Americans had created and nurtured, the leader said at a meeting on Wednesday. The leader made the remarks in reference to the latest U.S. military aggression, which has drawn a wave of damning reactions from officials and movements across the region and triggered furious public protests outside the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad on Tuesday. As many as 31 fighters from the popular forces lost their lives and dozens more sustained injuries in the U.S. airstrikes that targeted their bases in Anbar province in western Iraq near Syria's border late Sunday. Ayatollah Khamenei further responded to a tweet by Donald Trump in which the U.S. president threatened that Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price. Ooh. The Americans must realize how the regional people, including those in Iraq and Afghanistan, hate them for the crimes they have perpetrated, and that this hatred would eventually seep out somewhere, Ayatollah Khamenei pointed out. So, where, for those who don't know your history, the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s was very, very bloody. It was very bloody. You had civilian airliners being shot down by, U.S. Navy. You had all types of just massive ships being bombed.
A lot of like espionage type shit.
Oh yeah. But they, accidental, people accidentally getting killed. Ships being tossed over.
Yeah, it was just like a lot of shit.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of shit that we're not typically accustomed to on a day-to-day basis. Like that was like their existence, man. It was always some shit.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me get to the last one. We have other events that need to be attended to. This one is from the Associated Press. New Russian weapon can travel 27 times the speed of sound. Can't really read this. A new intercontinental weapon that can fly 27 times the speed of sound became operational Friday. Russia's defense minister reported to President Vladimir Putin, bolstering the country's nuclear strike capability. Putin has described the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle as a technological breakthrough comparable to the 1957 Soviet launch of the first satellite, Sputnik. The new Russian weapon and a similar system to be developed by China have troubled the United States, which has pondered defensive strategies. The avant-garde is launched atop an intercontinental ballistic missile, but unlike a regular missile warhead that follows a predictable path after separation, it can make sharp maneuvers in the atmosphere en route to target, making it much harder to intercept. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu informed Putin that the first missile unit equipped with the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle entered combat duty. I congratulate you on this landmark event for the military and the entire nation, Shoigu said later during a conference call with a top military leaders. The Strategic Missile Forces Chief, Sergei, said during the call that the avant-garde was put on duty with a unit in the Orenburg region in the southern Ural Mountains. Interesting. Putin unveiled the avant-garde among other prospective weapon systems in his State of the Nation address in March 2018, noting that its ability to make sharp maneuvers on its way to the target will render the missile defenses useless. The Russian leader noted that avant-garde is designed using new composite materials to withstand temperatures up to 2,000 Celsius. That's 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit, resulting from a flight through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. The military said the avant-garde is capable of flying 27 times faster than the speed of sound. It carries a nuclear weapon with up to 2 megatons. Putin has said Russia had to develop the avant-garde and other prospective weapons systems because the U.S. efforts to develop a missile defense system that he claimed could erode Russia's nuclear deterrent. Moscow has scoffed at U.S. claims that its missile shield isn't intended to counter Russia's massive missile arsenals. So you have this missile that has the ability to go into space and come right back down. You don't have a missile deterrent for that. Some have argued that you can use a laser to try to shoot this thing down, but a laser is only good from a certain distance, and lasers require lots and lots of power. Lasers right now, for all intents and purposes, from what I understand, the U.S. only has a laser that can go 1,000 feet. This thing is already 36,000 feet in the air, maybe 70,000 feet. You just don't have the capability of shooting it down. I think, and I think we talked about this with Super Triz before, you could use a satellite to shoot it down, but even at a satellite, the satellite has to be in the right position to actually track something like this.
I was going to say the satellite would have to be able to geospatiate, right, at a moment's notice. So it'd have to have some sort of thruster capacity or something that allows it to pivot, right, and aim, and then aim a laser that's basically going to be pointed in a straight line. So there's a lot of calculation that would be involved in that, and I don't, to my knowledge anyway, I don't know of any satellites that are up there that have that capability just yet.
Yeah, most satellites are just there for radio communications, but a satellite that could actually shoot something down, that's supposed to be illegal under the United Nations agreement that you're not supposed to weaponize space. But that's the extent of it. But thank you all for joining us. Please hit the like button if not already done so. Share the video if possible. Also hit that notification bell so you get all the updates from the Black Brain Trust, including those posted on the community tab. Peace and shalom.
Peace.